Please be seated. The court is now back in session. The floor is now given to the lead co-lawyers for civil parties so that they can put questions to this expert. You may proceed. Mr. President, the assigned lawyers are Moitsawanari and Christine Martino. President, yes, they may proceed. Swanari, good morning, Mr. President, and good morning, Your Honors, and everyone in and around the courtroom. I have some questions to put to this expert. First, I'd like to seek your permission. As part of my question, I will quote parts of his books, and those parts have not yet been translated into Khmer. Therefore, the quote will be read by me in English, and that's the quote that shall be displayed on the screen with your permission. President, yes, you may do so. Thank you, says the counsel. Good morning, Mr. Expert. During the last 2 days, questions and issues and subject matters have been put and responded by you, that is, between you and the bench and the prosecution. However, the process was done in the English language, so it is rather difficult for us, the national lawyers. On top of that, your book has not been translated into Khmer, and I try to avoid repetitive questions already asked by the bench or by the prosecution. And please bear with me. If you think my question is repetitive, please indicate so, and there is no need for you to respond, or you might wish to elaborate further on those points. And I thank you in advance for that. Yesterday, you testified before the court regarding the criticism, self-criticism, and the livelihood meetings that you said were a policy implemented within the party rank as well as amongst the people living in the cooperatives. You also stated that the city dwellers, in particular those people who fled from the liberated zone and took refuge in Phnom Penh city, deserve what they got, because in their areas it was bombardment and the war was ongoing. And after the evacuation from Phnom Penh city, they were considered new people in the cooperative they assigned to live in. Based on your research, was the implementation of the policy of criticism and self-criticism resulted in any impacts on the new people living in the cooperative, particularly those who were considered non-communist and they were subject to re-education or refashioning?
As I understand it, criticism and self-criticism took place within official organizations and within the party systematically. For new people who were taken to the countryside, in their collectives, there were study sessions which were ideological training sessions, ideological propaganda sessions, and if somebody was denounced as having, for instance, gathered fruit when they should not have done, then they would be expected to make self-criticism. Very often that self-criticism was judged not sufficient, and they would be either taken to a prison or more often killed for having transgressed the rules laid down by the party. But as far as I understand it, new people did not participate in systematic criticism, self-criticism sessions.
Thank you. My next question is related to certain events regarding the evacuation of people from Phnom Penh city, as well as the livelihood of the people in the cooperative. In particular, I will focus on the consequences and the suffering those people suffered under the implementation of the CPK policy. And in your book, on page 269 in English, with English EN 00396477, and the French EN is 00639803. I'd like to read the following quote in English.
Many of them were teenagers. Some only 12 or 13 years old, not much taller than AK-47s. They carry manfully on their shoulders, in their eyes. City girls wearing lipsticks and youth with long hair were prostitutes and perverts. The proof of all they had heard about the bourgeoisie's loathsome ways.
And on page 270 of your same book, with EN in English 00396478, French 006398030204. I'd like to read the following quote.
In the events that follow, and some of those involved later admitted as much. But it was not dominant emotion that day. More common, especially among the younger troops, was a slow, silent anger directed against the city and its entire works. End of quote.
Mr. Expert, based on your research, were the teenage Khmer soldiers possessing the real hatred and the anger against the city dwellers? And what were the levels of the anger and hatred? Was it the ideology of the Khmer Rouge that they were indoctrinated?
Khmer Rouge ideology certainly played a part, but there was a deeper basis. In many peasant revolutions through history, hatred of the city has been a factor. And the Khmer Rouge recruited in the most remote and the poorest areas young soldiers who were simply totally unfamiliar with city life, uncomfortable with it. They regarded it as something alien, something hostile, and something to be destroyed. The two reinforced each other, Khmer Rouge ideology and the anti-city, the anti-urban feelings of people from very remote areas. And I don't think that is in any sense unique to Cambodia. It has happened all through history.
Thank you. My next question on this point is the following. As a consequence, did you know the actions committed by those Khmer Rouge immediately after they arrived in Phnom Penh? What did they commit to those city dwellers?
There was looting, which was not called looting, but it was in effect looting. They were charged with bringing about the evacuation of the population as rapidly as possible. So people were herded by the soldiers into processions going out into the countryside, regardless of the condition of those people. Pregnant women about to give birth were forced to leave. People in hospitals were forced to leave, regardless of their condition. There were certainly cases of kindness. There were Khmer Rouge soldiers who tried to help, tried to alleviate the distress of those leaving. But in the majority of cases, they simply carried out orders more or less brutally. And there were certainly exemplary killings all the way along of people who didn't follow orders quickly enough, those who wanted to go back to their houses. There were killings to intimidate the rest so that they did as the soldiers wished.
Thank you. Now I'd like to read a quote from your book on page 272 in English. That is 00396480, and in French 00639806. I'd like to read the following in English.
To move more than 2.5 million people out of a crowded metropolis at a few hours' notice, with nowhere for them to stay, no medical care, no government transport, and little or nothing to eat, was to invite human suffering on a colossal scale. The 600,000 or so authentic city dwellers who had lived in Phnom Penh since before 1970, evacuation meant leaving behind everything they held dear and entering an unknown world for which they were totally unprepared.
Regarding your description of the event, is that it invited human sufferings on a colossal scale. Would you be able to provide further explanation regarding this point?
In more normal circumstances, a population movement of that kind would have been very carefully prepared. There would have been medical stations or at least some kind of medical assistance available along the way. There would have perhaps been some kind of transport organized. There would have been food supplies along the way. None of that was done. The goal was simply to move people, and however unpleasant it was for them during the movement, that was not really taken into account. And this is a general point. There was consistently, throughout the Khmer Rouge period, a disregard of human suffering. That the city dwellers managed to cope as well as they did was perhaps because Cambodians, even in the cities, had still links with the countryside, much as in certain European nations during the Second World War, people managed, despite very short food supplies at that time during the war, managed to find ways to survive. The resilience of the city dwellers was probably much greater than one would have expected.
Thank you, Mr. Short. My next question is regards to the psychological impact those people suffered when they arrived at the cooperative where they were forced to engage in hard labor. In your book on page 319, that is with English EIN 00396527 and in French 0063987425. The quote is the following.
To the former town dwellers, adjusting to life in the countryside was even more traumatic than in Phnom Penh was for the intellectual. For both, it was a double blow. Physically, they were deprived of the creature comforts that had taken for granted throughout their lives. Physically, they were enslaved, confined within a political and ideological straitjacket that grew steadily tighter. The deportees were at one end of the party scale of concern, the intellectual at the other, but its approach to both was the same. The physical change was so overwhelming for the new people that at first it drowned out every other consideration. Many were terrified. We had the impression, one wrote, of having been abandoned in the middle of a hostile land. They arrived in the village that seemed frozen in time, where people still suffer from yaw, dropsy, and other diseases, which were supposed to have been eradicated from Cambodia decades before. Like the intellectuals, the deportees had to learn everything from the bottom up, to build primitive wooden huts, to plough, to plant vegetables and rice, usually in conditions far harsher than the returned student endured. Like the peasants, they used potash extracted from the cinders of wood fires as a substitute for soup. In the flooded rice paddies, they wrapped cloth between their legs as protection against minuscule leeches, which could enter the penis and the anus or the vagina, causing excruciating pain until days later they detached themselves and were flushed out.
According to your analysis and based on your experience regarding the implementation of the policy and the ideology of the communist, can you tell the court to which degree of trauma suffered by the deportees who were suddenly deprived of everything they owned and was forced to live in the cooperatives or in the forest? In particular, those new people who evacuated through the cooperative?
I'm not sure I can judge what degree of trauma because that is a question for a psychologist, a psychiatrist. Excuse me. But certainly it was an extraordinarily wrenching experience. However, everything has two sides. It was wrenching for the city dwellers to come into a very primitive environment, but it was precisely the fact that large parts of Cambodia had been left in such a primitive and backward state that gave the reason to the Khmer Rouge for their revolution.
Thank you. My next question is in regards to the food supply, the ration given to the people living in the cooperative, and the different kinds of ration given to the best people and the new people. Once again, I will quote from your book, that is on page 320 to 321. English EN is 00396528 and French 00639876-77. And on page 321, the English EN is 00396529. The French is 0063 9878. Here is the quote.
For the local court, food was an essential means of control, calibrated by the differing treatment of new and base people. For the base people, life was bearable. The plight of the new people was a constant reminder to them of their own relative good fortune, which in turn was designed to incite for former to work harder to reforge themselves in order to progress from being depositees to candidates of full right status with a corresponding improvement innovation. It added up to so many conflicting imperatives that in practice most cards opted for the simplest solution. They and the base people ate well, the new people ate badly, hunger remained a punitive weapon, the death toll from malnutrition and related disease stayed high, and the health and strength of the new people continued to decline.
At this passage, you mentioned about food as an essential means of control and about the different rations between the new and base people. According to your knowledge, was this also a policy rendered by the high echelon of Democratic Cambodia regime?
No, it wasn't. It was the food was used as a means of control by the local officials. It was one of the best means of control and motivation that they had. But from the top, the word came down from the standing committee that people must be fed properly. It didn't happen because the system was dysfunctional, it didn't work. And when local cadres tried, on the one hand, to follow the orders coming from the center, on the other hand, to control their population, and thirdly, to force people to work hard enough to produce large amounts of rice, they were caught in a web of contradictions from which they decided the best answer, in most cases, was to apply extremely harsh policies. So you can't... Pol Pot and the leadership were certainly responsible because they allowed this situation to arise and did nothing to stop it. But it was not because of a direct order to the lower levels, use food to control the population.
Also, at this passage, based on your research regarding the implementation by the Khmer Rouge cadres of this policy or practice on the people, especially those who had been evacuated and were forced to live and work hard in the cooperative, what were the kinds or the levels of treatments that different kinds of people received differently?
Yes, indeed. The new people, the people from the cities, had much worse rations, at least in the first 2 years, because from 1978 onwards, the distinction between new people and old people was progressively abolished. But in the early years, yes, the new people had much worse conditions than the old people, and there were a variety of reasons for that. It was partly, if you like, punishment, because they had been in the towns rather than joining the revolution early on. It was partly to motivate them, to show their revolutionary loyalty and work their way up to becoming old people. It was partly, I won't say revenge, but a desire to make them understand how hard life was in poor areas in the countryside. there were lots of different motives at work. But the result was they were fed very badly, they had to work very hard, and over time, more and more of them starved to death.
Regarding starvation, I'd also like to quote a portion from your book that starvation was a tool used in the countryside. The quote is on page 320 in English with the English EN 00396528 and in French 00639876. The quote is the following.
Hunger was a weapon in the countryside, no less than in the re-education camps. He who does not work does not eat was applied in the Cambodian cooperatives with a literalness the Russian had never dreamed of. In a bad area, a day's work earned one bowl of watery rice soup. Those too ill to work got nothing. Illness itself was often equated with opposition to the regime, or at least a lack of revolutionary consciousness, which was considered almost as bad, and the rural clinics, where untrained nurses dole out traditional medicines, were no more than charnel houses. But hunger compounded by non-existent health care was a double-edged sword.
The passage that I just read, does it reflect what you responded to my last question? When you talk about the starvation and the non-provision of or non-existence of health care to the people in the cooperative as a double-edged sword. The question is, based on your research, was there a severe consequence on the livelihood of the people living in the cooperative, in particular those people who were considered non-communists and were subject to refashioning?
To begin with, just a small correction. It may be the translation, it may be from you. I didn't write that starvation was a tool. I wrote that hunger was a tool. There is a very important difference. You reduce the food as a punishment or in order to make people work harder or for whatever reason. Starvation was not what the regime wished or what it intended. And I think this is important. Pol Pot actually wanted people to be healthy so they could work hard, and he repeatedly in his speeches talked about the need to feed people properly. But in practice, it didn't happen. And it didn't happen because he and the Standing Committee failed to make sure that it happened. So at the lower levels, officials who were overwhelmed used hunger as a means of control, and the result was to weaken the population, have many people dying from starvation, and so on. This is why I say a double-edged sword. It was a means of control at the local levels, but the result was you had fewer people to work, therefore less production, and that was not at all what the leadership wanted.
President, I noticed the International Council for Anunchi, Mr. Coupe, on his feet. That you may proceed.
Mr. President, maybe I didn't hear it correctly in my earphone, but I would like to make a small correction in respect of the quote from the civil parties. A lawyer, I didn't hear the words Lenin's dictum. And that is in the quote. Just for the record, I would like to make that correction.
Much wonderful, thank you. I'd like now to move on to my next question regarding the forced marriage. Yesterday, Mr. Expert, you already stated to the court and the prosecution that the CPK made Cambodia as a state in which Cambodia was regarded as slaves. They did not have their private life and no rights to decide on who that they would marry through. I'd like again to read a quote from your book on page 325 to 326 with the English EN 00396533 to 34 and the French EN 00639883. The quote is the following.
Free choice of spouse was explicitly condemned. To underline the social aspect, weddings were celebrated collectively for a minimum of 10 couples. After a marriage had been consummated, the couple often lived apart. End of quote. No.
What kinds of punishments were used regarding the right to choose a partner? Can you give the court examples based on your research of the real concrete examples that were used as means to force people to obey Angka and to marry based on the instruction of Angka?
The possibility of not obeying did not arise because to disobey Angka would lead to death. You either did it, what you were told, or you died.
Thank you. My next question is related to the policy implementation of communal eating in the cooperative. I'd like to read the quote from your book on page 345. EN in English is 00396553 and in French 0063990809. The quote is the following.
Communal eating quickly became one of the most detested aspects of life under the Khmer Rouge, but everyone else hated it. The food supply sharply diminished as the cook pilfered provisions for their own use or for the village chiefs. The cohesion of the family, already under pressure, was weakened further. Women in particular felt it undermined their traditional role. The base people lost their privileges. No longer could they get by with the produce of their fruit trees and the vegetable plots beside their house, because now, like everything else, these were communally owned. Their carts and oxen were seized. So were private grain stocks, fish net, bicycle, and anything else which might set the individual apart from the mass. In many villages, the larger houses, which also often belonged to base people, were dismantled to provide wood for the new communal dining halls and uniform smaller huts, barely big enough to sleep in, built in their place. In the countryside, those with power, the Chlop, the soldiers, commune and district officials ate separately and well. Some had 4 meals a day and personal cooks to prepare their favorite dishes. Railway workers and certain other privileged groups were given special ration of meat and rice.
On this particular point, I would like to ask you, based on your research, on the ideology of communism as well as the widespread practice during the democratic Cambodia period. Can you advise the Chamber concerning the impact, the direct impact and foreseeable impact of this communal dining on the people? In other words, can you enlighten the court on the consequences of having a communal dining on the people?
It was another step in the elimination of personal freedoms. The freedom to exist as a family, to be able to prepare your own food. These may seem very small things. They are things which everybody in this court takes for granted. But if they are removed, it weakens the ties within the family, and it's another step towards the state which Angkar wished, in which everybody would have only one family, and that family was the collective, and more largely the organization in the widest sense of the term.
Thank you. Just now you also explained the court on the separation of members in the family under the control of Angkar, and yesterday you also told the court the reason behind the separation of family members. And as you may have been well aware that a Cambodian family has a tradition of living an extended family. They have attachment in the family. But during the Khmer Rouge period, they separated family members. Could you tell the court the impact or the consequences of such a policy of separation of young children from their parents? Can you also enlighten the court on the possibility of the mental impacts of the young children who are separated from their parents?
Well, once again, I'm afraid I am not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but from the Khmer Rouge point of view, it was a means of atomizing society so that the natural links within families and between extended families and between groups were broken, and each person was an atom uniquely dependent on Angkar, on the organization, the CPK. The psychological effect, well, you mentioned young children. Obviously, once children are taken away from their parents and are made dependent on another organization, they are much more easily influenced because all the family ties, the family influences have been removed. So that was important to be able to bring up a new generation of Cambodians who were dedicated to the Khmer Rouge because they had known nothing else. And the other part was to demolish, in that respect as well as in all others, the individuality of each Cambodian.
Thank you, Mr. Expert. I move on now concerning the policy of separating family members. I would like to ask you whether or not you see this policy applied across the country, and was it applied with the senior cadres of the Khmer Rouge leaders, for example? Was this policy applied with the family of Khieu Samphan, Nuon Chea or Ieng Sari at that time?
The families of the senior leaders were given special treatment. Khieu Samphan's mother was in Phnom Penh with two helpers to look after her because she was very elderly. His wife and his children, young children at that time, were in Phnom Penh. Nuon Chea's mother was in Battambang, as far as I have been able to establish, and again had very special treatment. So at the highest levels, it was different. Even certain senior cadres, one layer down, also were able to have their families with them in Phnom Penh. In the countryside, in the provinces, yes, village cadres, district cadres lived with their families. It was not applied to them. They also ate much better. They had special meals and so on. So the conditions for anybody with power, whether at the central or the lower levels, were very different from those of the ordinary people.
So, is my understanding correct from your statement is that the policy of separating family member only apply to the ordinary citizen population on the ground, but not with the families of the senior leaders or leaders in the regions. Is that correct?
I should bring one qualification to what I just said. I said the families of people like Khieu Samphan were in Phnom Penh, but they didn't live with their families all the time. There is a story which Mr. Ying Sari told me when he and Vaughan Vet and Khieu Samphan and the others were living with Pol Pot in the bank buildings, K1. There was a rule that at that level of the leadership, visits could be made to the family once a week. So there was separation at that level. But certainly in the districts and the provinces, I think that didn't apply. The family lived together.
Thank you, Mr. Witness. Now I would like to once again refer to an extract from your book in relation to Mr. Khieu Samphan, who was accompanying Prince Sihanouk on his visit to the Liberation Zone. In your document, page 344 to 445, and in English 003965412242 and French 00639894.
In democratic Cambodia, for the first time during 2 provincial tours, he made that winter in the company of Khieu Samphan, one to the eastern and northern zones, the other to the northwest. It bowed me over, he wrote later. My people had been transformed into cattle. My eyes were opened to a madness which neither I nor anyone else had imagined. His account of those journey is self-centered and self-pitying. Yet there is no doubt that he was deeply shocked. The question was posed, could he continue to lend his name to a regime which inflicted such egregious suffering? End of quote.
In relation to this point, based on your research concerning the particular visit, to your knowledge, do you know that Prince Sihanouk was shocked by the living condition of people he witnessed during his visit? So my question to you is whether or not Mr. Khieu Samphan shared this observation. Did he observe the same event that then Prince Norodom Sihanouk witnessed concerning the living condition of people?
No, he did not. We did not discuss that visit. We did not discuss his views about the conditions that he witnessed on that kind of visit.
Since I am running out of time, I would like to ask you my final question. I would like to extract your book on page 3 to 8 from your book, ERN in English 00396536, French 00639886 I would like to read out the quote.
Passion, and all the other feelings that make up everyday life were seen as emanations of individualism to be banished for the collective good. In some parts of the country, it was forbidden even to laugh or sing. In pursuit of illumination, the people had to suffer. The people had to suffer. End of quote.
On this point, my last question for you, Mr. Expert. Do you know, to your knowledge, do the Khmer Rouge leader think that the suffering of the people is the price to be paid in order to accomplish their revolutionary goal? Was that what they had in mind? Or was it a distinct case for Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge regime, or it was the situation that could have happened in other countries as well, so long as it was under the communist rule?
That is a triple question. Suffering was one part of the answer is that suffering was collateral. It was a necessary, not necessary, but unavoidable effect of a policy designed to make Cambodia strong and prosperous very quickly. The ends justified the means. The end was good. Therefore, if people suffered along the way, that was regrettable perhaps, but it was unavoidable. The second aspect of suffering, and here we come back to something we discussed yesterday a little bit, the CPK was in many ways like a monastic sect, and suffering is a way. By suffering, you transform yourself, you purify yourself, you become a different and, in the Khmer Rouge view, much better person. So suffering had a positive function as well in the views of the Khmer Rouge leadership. And that is clearly attested by some of the documents and speeches. Was it unique to Cambodia? Yes, to this extent. But there are elements of it also in China. You reform yourself through labor, through hard work, through suffering. In the Soviet Union also, but particularly in China during the Maoist period. So it's an idea which is common to other systems, but it was taken much, much further in democratic Kampuchea.
Thank you once again, Mr. Expert. Mr. President, I have no further question. I thank you very much for granting me the opportunity to put the question. I would like to cede the floor to my international colleague.
Yes, good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Honors. Good morning, Mr. Short. I won't take that much time. And I'm going to ask you a few short questions, but following up on what my colleague just spoke about, you understood that we're particularly attached to the consequences of this regime on the population and on the civil parties that we are representing, of course. And for us to be all aware of your research, I would like to ask you, first of all, have you met victims? have you met victims of the regime? Because in what we see in your book, references are made, maybe I didn't understand them well, but references seem to be made essentially to leaders, to people who are very close to the leaders of the Khmer Rouge, but I don't have the feeling that many victims were questioned. Maybe I'm wrong. So,
you are absolutely right, and quite deliberately. There have been an immense number of books about the plight of the victims, which is really very well documented. There had been nothing to try to explain the mindset or get into the mindset of the regime. And my purpose in writing this book and doing the research was to delve in to the rationale of Pol Pot and those around him, including Khieu Samphan and Nguyen Chia. Why did they do this? Why did they take this route? And I quote in the book many of the victims from their writings. So in that sense, I think it was balanced. But my job was not to go and get yet more accounts from victims, because that was already out there.
And in the same line of thought, I have another question for you. I think the day before yesterday, Judge Cartwright asked you who you had questioned among the leaders, and she asked you if you had interviewed Nguyen Chia, and you said no. So I must say that we would like to know why you made this choice. Since Nguyen Chia is, as you know, a central figure, Pol Pot's alter ego even. Chandler also spoke about the osmosis between him and Pol Pot, and we spoke about this again. They were all living together, as you know. They knew each other very well. And here you could have dealt with someone who could have provided you with very precious information, even though we know that secrecy was something that was very, very important for Nguyen Chia. But however, he was interviewed by journalists. He allowed films to be made about him. Tet Sambat, as you know. So he is not someone who was impossible to approach.
Chronology is vital to, I'm sure, law, but certainly to history. You say Nguyen Chia was easy to approach. You are talking from the perspective of 2013. When I began the research on this book, it was 1999-2000. It was impossible to approach Nguyen Chia. I tried. It was very difficult to approach Khieu Samphan. He eventually agreed to see me, but it took 18 months. Yang Sari was also difficult. Nguyen Chia at that time had spoken to no one, would speak to no one. He lived on a house, in a small house, which I later visited, much later, on the Cambodian-Thai border at Pai Lin. And I think it was probably 5 or 6 years later before he agreed to see anybody. So it was not for want of trying, but you are transposing onto a perspective of 13 years ago the situation of today.
That's possible, yes, but it's true that this question that sticks out, and we see clearly that we have now the answer. So I'm going to move on now to a different question that we haven't dealt with that much, or only indirectly maybe, regarding communism. You say in your book that the Khmer Rouge leaders wanted to invent their own communism, to distinguish themselves from Marxist orthodoxy, and even rejected it. And you say that they wanted to create a form of intuitive communism, you could say. You even speak about illumination. And you explain as well that they use, in order to justify something that was very odd in terms of Marxism, they justified their attitude by resorting to the following explanation, and you said it yesterday, that in fact class is no longer a question of economic status, but a question of mentality, you said. And you spoke about this yesterday briefly, and what's surprising here, and I'd like to therefore get explanation from, is that these Khmer Rouge leaders retained very fundamental principles of Marxism, such as religion as the opium of the people. They wanted to eradicate Buddhism or other religions as well. And we have the feeling here, when we read your book, that Buddhism remains the guideline of the implementation of their revolution in certain terms. There are other examples, of course. So maybe this might seem contradictory. There are a lot of contradictories, of course, and contradictions in the Khmer Rouge regime. On the one side, Buddhism should not exist. On the other side, Buddhism is used as a basis to create this new form of Marxism. That's what I could perceive.
Thank you for the question. Every form of communism is, to some extent, national. Marx laid down the fundamental principles in the middle of the 19th century. Then in Russia, Lenin developed it on the basis of the system which he knew, which was of Tsarist autocracy. And that is the form that was taken by Stalinism, was taken until Stalin's death by Soviet communism. In China, China was a Confucian, still is a Confucian country. Communism was developed on the basis of Confucian thought. You find in China ideas, I used the term illumination in Cambodia. In China, in Chinese communist documents, they talk about virtue, a Confucian concept. So to me, it was completely normal that when Pol Pot and the CPK elaborated a system based on certain Marxist principles, but also based very much on what they had learned about the French Revolution and the Paris Commune, it would be on the basis of Buddhism. Because in order to make communism relevant to a country, it has to resonate with the underlying beliefs of the population, which in Cambodia are Buddhist. So I don't see that as a contradiction. And the fact that they wish to eliminate the Buddhist religion is, again, normal. It happened in other communist societies. No communist regime wants an ideological competitor, which is what religion gives.
Yes, I understand very well. But what is a little bit contradictory here, it is to try to eradicate in Cambodian society what is noxious and what Buddhism created, and at the same time, the Khmer Rouge used this. Well, I don't have a lot of time. Now, I'd like to ask you another question on something that we spoke about yesterday, or that you spoke about yesterday, rather, on the slave state. Moksa Vanari also referred to this earlier, and I'd like to return to this qualification, because it's very evocative. A slave state is indeed something we understand what it means immediately, and anybody can understand what this means. But if we go into the details, even though this qualification is very global, there are differences, however, in the way people were treated within the populations. People were treated in different ways in Cambodia. Let's say the base people were not treated as slaves, or not immediately, maybe at the end, or we could have said in a basic way that they were indeed treated like slaves, but not strictly speaking. The base people did not lose their rights as citizens. The new people indeed did lose their rights as citizens. They were not allowed to vote. I know that voting in 1976 was only theoretical, but however, it did exist. Whereas the new people did not, they had their rights, their voting rights suppressed. I don't have references here, but we spoke about it here yesterday when David Chandler also came to testify. He confirmed this. So, my question is, what do you think about this difference in treatment? Because on the one hand, there was the base people kept certain citizen rights, and on the other hand, a group which lost their rights as citizens and which was reduced to the status of enemy, and that had to be suppressed.
I accept the distinction you're making. A slave state is a generic term, and indeed there were distinctions of the extent to which people were enslaved. The base people were enslaved to a lesser degree. I would argue they were still slaves because in no meaningful sense did they have, were they able to make any of the choices. Base people could not travel as they wished. They couldn't decide where to live. They couldn't decide after communal eating came in what to eat. They couldn't, base people too could not decide who their daughters or sons should marry. The distinction, I absolutely accept, you're right, there is a distinction, but it was minimal. And the distinction over voting, I think, to me, a totally meaningless vote and no vote, we can argue about whether there is a significant difference. I think the slave state, if you have to pinpoint the particularity of democratic Kampuchea, the term slave state depicts it best because it was the only one, the only time this has happened in modern history, and other appellations can be very easily knocked down. Don't hold water. May I just say, I think at the end of your question, you talked about the new people as being enemies to be suppressed. I think that's too sweeping too, if the translation was correct. They were regarded as unreliable, but to be transformed, to be reformed as possible. The regime did not want to have them killed. It wanted to make them willing and useful servants, tools of its policies.
I'm going to react to your answer by quoting an excerpt from your book in French. The ERN is 00639 702 to 703, and in English it is 0039 6391. And you indicate at one point that you note that the enemy is incurably hostile, free translation. And you speak also you mention in this segment a borderline between the good ones and the bad ones. That is to say that if we cross this line, you speak about the forest. In fact, if you cross this line, we're on one side of the border or on the other side. And this line cannot be crossed. And you say the new people were on the other side of this line, and therefore their existence had no value. So maybe I'm interpreting the word value in very broad terms. So if the new people had no longer any worth, we can say that they could be disposed of. Either we could suppress them or force them to work, so their existence was very tenuous. That, however, was in the leaders' minds.
Yes, I remember the section of the book about the demarcation line between this side and that side, the forest and the village. I don't have the exact words, and I think I probably wrote them fairly carefully. You've paraphrased. It's here somewhere, but it's paraphrased. Yes, you're right. The existence was much more tenuous. Nonetheless, the goal was not to exterminate all the new people. The goal was to make them useful servants of the regime. And there are so many speeches in which Pol Pot and others talk about the need to make them, indeed, the need to feed them enough so that they could work. There was no rationale for the leadership to wish to destroy all the new people because the leadership needed them. I think that is taking it a stage further than the facts or certainly anything I have written or think warrants.
Mr. President, may I put a last question to the witness because I see that it's already past 12. Thank you. Now, regarding this population of deportees that ended up forced to work, and you spoke I'd like to speak about the second evacuation, which you spoke about yesterday briefly. And I'd like to speak about someone you quote, but not in this segment of the book, Mr. Pinatai. And during the second evacuation that took place at the end of 1975, he was evacuated. We spoke about lies as well. And let me read very quickly 3 sentences in his book, and I will give the ERNs in French: 0058 78 87, English 0058 76 09 19, and in Khmer 58 88 204 to 205.
The President. Council, please be advised to read more slowly when it comes to the year and number because the interpreter might not follow. And so please repeat the year and numbers again. Thank
you.
Yes, I'm sorry. I forgot to say that the document is E3 1811. So the French ERN 0058 78 87. English 0058 76 09 19. And in Khmer 58 88 204 to 205. And this second evacuation and the treatment that Pinatai was subjected to during this evacuation was very different, or seems to be very different, from the treatment that was inflicted upon him during the first evacuation, but that was still, quote-unquote, bearable, we can say. And he says, free translation. During this evacuation, we were 2,000 standing along the road, and put into trucks, 100 people in each truck, and we were pressed together. And then he describes this journey, this horrible journey, and he says that as of now, I have nothing to hope for. We are no longer human beings. And when they arrive in the middle of the jungle close to Pursat, he says that thousands of other deportees were there just waiting. So we see that there's a considerable number, thousands of people, who are transported in a horrendous way towards locations that are very unhospitable. The jungle, in this case, for these thousands of people mentioned. And my question is, a lot was said, well, often it was said that the leaders knew what was happening. And this evacuation that was covered up in lies in order was one problem, but the question is, how was it possible, since the objective was to distribute the population in a productive way, how was it possible for intellectuals, for leaders who had studied, for intelligent leaders, how was it possible for them to accept the second evacuation under these conditions? Okay, the first one, of course, was swift because it was a swift victory. But however, the second evacuation could have been planned. So we get the feeling here that these leaders were either incapable or they didn't think, or maybe they resorted to horrible methods to compensate for their fear, maybe, or their inability to manage the situation. So this is mind-boggling when I look at this with a bit of distance. I'd like to have your opinion on that.
You used the word incapable. I think this is something we have not discussed at all at this case, this hearing. But one of the hallmarks of the democratic Kampuchea regime was that it was incompetent. It was incapable. It made a mess of most of what it tried to do. And the lack of planning, the lack of organization in the second transfer of population was an example of this. I don't want to understate, I don't want to downplay the suffering that the new people endured, the base people also, as much in some areas, less in others. It was horrendous, but there were two elements to it, three elements. One was incompetence and inability to organize anything efficiently. The other was the very low educational level of the cadres in the countryside, most of whom were illiterate and who could only receive instructions orally because they couldn't read the documents. And the third was the policy which held that the new people were expendable in the sense that it didn't matter that much if numbers of them died. That was part of the process. Although they wanted as many new people as possible to live and to work, because then they would produce, they were not regarded as being intrinsically of any worth. They were of worth for what they could produce. So those three things came together.
In my very last question, it's a short one. You spoke about Khieu Samphan's visits to the provinces and about the reports he would draft when he returned to Phnom Penh. And do you have any elements, or did you see any elements from Mr. Khieu Samphan or documents that relate these terrible problems in the provinces that were obvious or that should have been obvious to him?
No, I haven't seen any documents from Khieu Samphan. There are documents from others, some of which we've discussed here. I think Mr. Khieu Samphan would have justified to himself, as the leadership did, whatever collateral suffering was taking place as necessary to reach the end which they wished to achieve. I don't think he would have asked himself very many questions about it.
Moi non plus.
Neither do I. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
The President. Thank you, Council, and thank you, Mr. Expert. The time is now appropriate for lunch adjournment. The Chamber adjourns now and resume at 1:30 this afternoon. Court officer is instructed to assist the expert during his break. And have him return to this courtroom this afternoon by 1:30. Security guards are also instructed to bring Mr. Khieu Samphan to the holding cell downstairs and have him return to this courtroom before 1:30 this afternoon. The court is now adjourned.